Hi everyone, this is Nandita and welcome to the Shakti Collective. And today we have with us Sara. Sara, would you please like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So thank you, Nandita. So my name is Sara Basson. I'm at Google, uh, working in the area of accessibility and disability inclusion, both in my day job, and then I'm also the president of the employee resource group associated with disability, which is Disability Alliance at Google.
That is amazing. And thank you so much for being here. We are excited to hear from you. And how would you describe accessibility in 3 words?
Um, okay, if I could sneak in a little teeny tiny fourth word, I would say equity and innovation for disabilities.
Thank you. And thinking about, equity and innovation, I feel like I have an idea where you're going with that, but I'd love to hear, why you care about accessibility, like what drives your passion to work in this field.
Right. Well, I think basically we would all agree that it's a human rights issue. Um, and uh, I also feel like there are many human rights issues, of course, but for the accessibility and disability inclusion, I feel as though, in a sense, the way that you can influence, there are lots of influences you can have without actually turning the world upside down. So the view of making sure that you've provided adequate tools and access to people with disabilities. So while there are all of these sort of systemic discrimination issues and so on that you would have with any other underrepresented group, there's also a very clear set of concrete actions that you could take to improve accessibility and therefore change the narrative. And I'm impatient, so it's sort of nice to know that you can do things with tools and not wait for the world to pivot on its axis.
Absolutely. And thinking about, when you started your journey in this field, what was your first aha moment with accessibility?
Um, I think actually my first aha moment it was probably a oh no moment, and that was I started out working or studying speech pathology with the goal of working in speech therapy, and so my aha moment there was, um, well, first of all, it's very hard to move the needle when you're dealing, say, with people with brain damage and so on. Say I was working with stroke patients. And so one aha was, oh my God, I'm so eager to make progress, and I don't feel that I'm making as much progress as I would like. Also, the fact that it was very much one-on-one. So an aha movement was how could I have bigger, broader influence on this rather than doing the one-on-one. So that was actually a very frightening moment because here I was studying it and thinking, I don't think I really want to work in this. But ultimately it became an aha moment because I think I was able to leverage those skills and use them more broadly.
I love that. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Thinking about, your current role and the kind of work you're doing today, can you share a little bit more about, how you are creating impact within this space?
um, Within this space. So, first of all, it's very exciting to be doing this at Google because, two reasons. One is, of course, the very big and broad impact that Google has on so many people. So when we talk about the billions of people with disabilities worldwide and things like that, and wow, Google really can touch them. So if you change processes and practices at Google, it could have that level of effect. And then also, um, and then also just the fact that Google is considered a role model and an icon in the field, and so lots of other companies copy. And so you sort of feel like if I do amazing things that have greater inclusion for people with disabilities at Google, then other companies will imitate our practices. So we're working on a number of things, sort of So there is, of course, the issue around product accessibility itself, and my focus is on the internal Googler experience. There are lots of other teams that are focusing on the external products. So the products that we use internally, or even the products that we use externally that are being used as an internal Googler as well. And so how do we ensure that it's a good experience for Googlers? And then all of the other things that contribute to a positive experience. So, what are our hiring practices like? And, how are our support tools and accommodations? And how is the culture? And how is the etiquette? And how do we make sure that all of those things are running smoothly, and also very much with input from the community, which is one of the very joyous things for me about being so deeply involved in Disability Alliance. So the ability to, what is it that one of our key activists in the community, Aubrey Lee, says often is nothing about us without us, and nothing without us at all. And so, feeling like there's this really close and direct pipeline into the community and input from the community in all the decisions that we make.
I love that. Thank you. And thinking about the people and really thinking about the community during the course of your journey, I know it might be hard to name one person, but is there one person or a couple of people who have really influenced your career within accessibility?
Right. I would call out Dmitry Konevsky, who is a research scientist at Google. He's a mathematician by training. I worked with him before coming to Google, and now we're both at Google. And he is himself deaf from the age of 1. And I got involved with him early in projects, and he was just an engine for innovation and solutions that have ultimately really been game-changing for the community. Most recently, if you're familiar with it, Live Transcribe, which is captioning on Android devices, and the testimonials that we receive are amazing. So it was both that fed and inspired just a couple of things. One is a lot of things I've already mentioned, the ability to have really big impact, the fact that disability itself can be a catalyst for major research and innovation, was inspiring and exciting. I mean, it's sort of great to be able to have large impact, but I also come from a research background. So the fact that you're using the kind of tools and techniques that come from research just keeps it also scientifically and professionally exciting.
Absolutely. And that's really amazing. I definitely do use that feature, so I do love that.
Wonderful.
And thinking about, I guess, barriers or frustrations, what do you believe is one of the greatest challenge that we face in really making accessibility part of a more common everyday practice in tech industry?
Um, so some of the barriers is what you're asking about, or?
Yeah, barriers, and I guess what do you think is the greatest challenge we face in really making accessibility like an everyday practice? So that
Right.
it's not just constrained to, oh, this person's doing it or some people are doing it. I think how can we all just get into it, making sure
Right.
everyone's doing it?
One issue is always prioritization. And so especially in the tech companies where prioritization is often counted in terms of how many people are impacted, and if I put in this feature, how many people will be using it. And so shifting the mindset so that prioritization looks at more than just the raw numbers. And so we'd like to talk about the fact that you can look at impact as 1 billion people are using this new feature, and it has improved their lives by a little teeny tiny increment, versus a smaller number where the impact has been profound. And so it's a 100% impact for a smaller community versus teeny tiny impact for 1 billion users, and just getting that mindset adopted. Also, I think within the disability community, probably the truth. This is probably true for all underrepresented groups, but I think particularly in the disability community, is there's such diversity of needs.
Mhm.
So as much as we say you need to make this accessible, there are so many subparts to it. It's not, you're not just driving for a single community. And so, when we talk about the billion people, there's something a little bit disingenuous about it, because that billion people, each of them, each of them or each community needs a very different set of, modifications, implementations, enhancements. Then another challenge is it's hard. I know we sort of like to say things like, well, if you bake it in the beginning, it's just natural. If we're thinking now
Mhm.
about products, software engineering practices. And yet I have seen teams that are eager to build in accessibility, and it just doesn't come out right. I'm not myself a software engineer. Um, so it's
Wow.
it's sort of something when you're thinking, this is not a question of you need to evangelize and convince them it's important. They believe that it's important, and yet it's still taking multiple iterations. And so ideally, it would just be easier to build it in, and then all you need to do is once they know about it, it happens. But that's not quite the case. They know about it, and then it takes work, and then it takes ongoing work. And
It's
that's
almost like a maintenance in its own way, it sounds like. It's not just, you do it and you have put your hands up, right? You're done. You have to just be able to bake it. Like you said, not only bake it in the process, but make sure you continue to bake it almost.
Right, right. And that everybody is trained, and that everybody is skilled, and that you have all of the resources available, and including beyond just the software engineering skills, also all of the user experience skills. And does your company prioritize the UX, the user experience, as highly as they do, just check the box accessibility? And
So
so
how do
those are
you
challenges.
even, because that sounds, obviously that's a huge challenge, right? But I mean, especially with a company like Google, like how do you even scale accessibility across such a large enterprise? What are some ways in which have worked for you that, other organizations can adopt and learn from?
Right, right. I don't think that we have a secret sauce, and I think that we're using all the methodologies here. Critical that you have it as top down, because there are people who say, I'm going to do various things just because I know it's the right thing to do. And then there are others who are going to say, I will do it if it's listed as one of the company key objectives. So you need to make sure from the top down that your
Mhm.
company is making all of the right statements and commitments. You need to make sure that there is training available, that you actually hire people that are already savvy about issues in inclusion and accessibility. So the burden is not entirely on your company to do all the training. And I know we're involved in this initiative called Teach Access, which is a consortium of companies that work with universities, where universities agree to include accessibility in their curricula, and then companies agree to include it as some priority in their hiring plan. So it's sort of bottom up, and it's side to side. And how do you just make sure that there's a drumbeat? I know we have various days that are associated to accessibility and disability. How do you make it much more pervasive, really much more of a drumbeat? You shouldn't have a week of events or a day of events. I mean, you should, that's great, because that gives you immersion. But how do you just sort of keep it going? Make sure that every month there are presentations and talks. How do you make sure that those presentations and talks are imparting the messages that you want to impart? I think also when we do these presentations, and we'll bring in people with disabilities, we bring in superstars and heroes and Paralympians. And that's wonderful in terms of imparting the message of, look how much people in this community can achieve, given that I have been asked things like, can blind people actually use a computer? So when there's that level of ignorance in the community overall, and then I love to point out, well, so and so on our team is blind from birth, and he has his PhD in computer science from NYU. So I guess it is possible to use a computer.
Right.
So the Paralympian type, the heroics, and look what I've overcome, is wonderful. But I think we need to do this more thoughtfully, and have a range of topics. Have topics also that show this is really hard. Not just I overcame it and I'm actually more accomplished than you with my multiple disabilities.
Right.
That's inspirational. But then what does that person walk away? I mean, indeed, if as an engineer watching that, do you conclude, well, they're doing just fine, don't need my help here, which is clearly not the message that you.
Right.
So really making sure that you have the messages on an ongoing basis, making sure that not just from the top down, that all of your management and senior leadership understand it, prioritize it, support people who say, we're not going to advance unless we have this or that accessible, even if that means missing some deadline. So you need kind of the middle management and their management support and the individuals being trained and lots of cultural messages. And another thing that is key, and this is interesting because if you think about what comes first and what comes second here, the more you
Mm-hmm.
hire people with disabilities, the less work everybody else needs to do in terms of evangelizing and teaching and training, because it just becomes natural. And I remember one group saying that, had, say, a blind employee on the team, it just became part of their culture, as in, we're not done until Joe can use this product. And I'm thinking, great, I don't have to say anything. Then it just becomes sort of natural. And can Joe use this product? They could figure it out as they're building it. So it's not like we just built the most accessible thing in the world, and then you discover that users don't actually like it. So the hiring things. But on the other hand, you also want to have a culture that's welcoming and inclusive before you bring in people and where they have to have a difficult experience rolling boulders uphill, just
Right.
so that the rest of us could get trained. So there's a balancing act.
No, for sure, agree. And I think it also ties back to your previous point of really making it part of everyday practice. Because if you have a more inclusive culture, like you said, and you have more people that are being inclusive and being representative, then that'll also reflect in your products, which is amazing, for
Right,
sure. For
right.
sure. And so thinking about those people who may be in, slightly different cultures or who are trying to really, not just create this like accessibility from the top down, but really from the bottom up, right? Where there are people who are trying to be champions on their team. What is some advice you can give to them so they can be effective change agents for accessibility in their
You mean
organization?
in our organization, or people, you're talking about people in different companies? In our
Different
organization, people, different
just
companies?
different companies, not necessarily Google, but just different companies where, like companies like Google really prioritize accessibility, right? Where if you join Google, it's important to them. But what if you're in a company that may not be the case, but you may be that quote unquote lone wolf, or you may be that person trying to really build accessibility into the culture? What are some ways in which they can be more effective change agents?
Right. So if you are working in a smaller setting and others don't know about it, so the first part
Mhm.
is knowledge, and so you need to be the one. If you are able to do this, do the trainings yourself or bring in the trainings. Make sure that this is part of the discussion. Small company, basically, you need everyone on board with you. So so it's not just going to be one presentation and then cross your fingers. It's going to be presentations and trainings and signage and experiences and then also get into it through the things that excite your company. So I don't know how small a company we're talking about, but for example, if the company does hackathons, and so they really value how creative and innovative can we be, let's make disability themes the topic of a hackathon, which will both potentially create innovation within your company, but also kind of in the background create awareness and commitment,
Right.
and people will pick up on that and perhaps take that knowledge to their day jobs.
Absolutely. And I guess thinking about the other side, where people who don't know about accessibility but are starting to become involved, what advice would you give to those who are thinking about, jumping in and getting involved within digital accessibility?
Right, right. Well, I mean, there are the NGOs out there to help you. So we've become very involved with Disability In, as a key engine in disability inclusion in the workplace. And so I would recommend that that people just get exposed to that, participate in some webinars. They have a lot of resources, especially again, if we're talking about a small company that can't create it itself. And that's, by the way, also another thing I love about being in this community. We work closely with Microsoft, with Amazon, with Salesforce, with Apple, and we all have this view of, are our companies competitors? Sure, let them compete on something else. On this, everyone, they've all been, extremely sort of generous and sharing and working together in terms of how can we solve this problem. So you can reach out to, in addition to entities like Disability In, it'll give you access to all of these other companies and perhaps other companies that are at the same size and scale as your company, but maybe a little bit further along on the journey, and they can mentor you along.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. And one parting question is, what is that one thing, thinking about, getting overwhelmed because there's so many resources, there's so much knowledge out there. If we started small, right, what is that one thing you could tell someone else that they could go today, right, do immediately in the short term to start thinking about accessibility and really baking that into their life?
So if it were, say, a leader in the organization, so that they have actually really just a larger scale of influence, I'll cheat and I'll go a little bit more than one. I'm a strong proponent of become part of an ERG. Create an ERG if you don't have one, not hard to do. Join the ERG if you do have one, and that will automatically and immediately give you more exposure to people with disabilities if you haven't had that before. And then another thing that somebody in leadership, and we advocate to our leaders, especially our executive sponsors for Disability Alliance, our ERG, is talk about it. You have a big pulpit. You do all hands meetings with lots of people. Make sure this is always part of your conversation. I know one of our executive sponsors, whenever he has a leadership meeting with all of his managers and directors, he actually has an event, has brought in Special Olympics New York with athletes, and then gotten other people involved in it. Even if you're giving a talk at somebody else's event, weave it in as part of something that is important to your company, something that is important to you, something that your audience can do, even if the talk and whatever it is that you're there promoting is something else. That's another lovely thing about accessibility I should have brought in earlier, and that is it fits into everything. It doesn't matter what it is that you're talking about. There's going to be some element if you're talking about people issues, if you're talking about technical issues. So weave it in so that it just becomes part of the narrative.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.